Welcome back. With 1,000 people every day moving into the state of Florida, affordable housing remains a major problem. The Florida Policy Project has been examining the issue and is offering some solutions. The group was started by former State Senator Jeff Brandis, who I spoke to about affordable housing earlier this week.
Understand, Florida has 1,000 people a day moving to the state. Affordable housing is one of the top issues of the state of Florida right now. And the state system that it currently utilizes doesn't really address the underlying changes, really has been unchanged for almost decades for how we address housing affordability in Florida. And so, we're calling on the legislature to do more by just moving towards best practices. So we've done a whole series of reports on what those best practices should look like, from changing zoning to addressing vouchers.
All right, let's start with the zoning part of it. We just had, a major push by the state's Senate President, Kathleen Passidomo, was sort of a live local. Did live local fix the zoning aspect of this?
Really not at all. I mean, I would say live local is probably a 3% solution to the overall problem. In fact, obviously, you have some communities that are pushing back against live local pretty stringently right now. We need to really address this more holistically. If you don't fix zoning, we don't fix housing. And that means addressing single family home zoning and allowing duplexes and quads to be built there through upzoning, to allowing smaller lot sizes so that people can afford the actual lots they're on. And then addressing other issues throughout the system that we lay out in our report. But the simple truth is we have to address these things. The state of Florida has to reset the incentives so that cities and counties will then come in line and allow for more housing units to be built. We're just never going to get there if we continue to follow the same old tired housing policies that we've had before. The shortest putt is accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law suites, granny flats, whatever you want to call them, that are on the backs of people's homes. I can tell you in Tampa Bay, it will cost you about $350,000 per apartment unit that you want to build. I can build that same accessory dwelling unit on the back of somebody's home for about $150,000 to $170,000. And so if we really need kind of an all hands on deck strategy, and that's something that Florida is currently greatly lacking.
In talking to some local mayors, I know that they're concerned about what the legislature has done. And when they hear you or others talk about increasing density, the fear is that developers are going to come in a way that will suddenly create 10, 12, 14-story buildings in neighborhood environments.
We need to look at best practices as to what works in communities. And what I don't think Live Local was set off of was best practices. I think it was largely written by developers who wanted certain things in their development projects and were able to put those through. I think we should really offer communities a menu of options. Now, they would have to choose from that menu in order to qualify for housing dollars from Tallahassee. But it would offer things like more accessory dwelling units, offer opportunities for upzoning, offer a robust voucher programs that they could initiate, and if they followed best practices to do that. But we really need to turn this into block grants to the counties. Look, every county has different set of problems. Miami-Dade has very different problems than Hardee or Hendry or Liberty County does. And so treating one size fits all housing solutions just don't work in Florida. But we need an opportunity to do that. And we think that the best way to do that is by following best practices. And those include utilizing housing vouchers and a best practice model for housing vouchers. For example, in Miami-Dade, people will wait almost 14 years if they get on the waiting list to get a voucher. That's unacceptable. In Hollywood, it's 6 years. In some other communities, it's much less. The national average is about 21 months. So we can move much more, we go much quicker if we establish a robust housing voucher program while we're addressing all these other issues like upzoning, like
let me just jump in. How do you create that more robust voucher system?
Well, we put in best practices for different housing systems. For example, we need to be scrubbing wait lists. The challenge is sometimes we have multiple entities that have housing wait lists and nobody's actually going back to scrub them. We actually need more dollars allocated towards those programs. We need more developers to buy in to accepting housing vouchers. One of the things we hear right now is developers don't want to take housing vouchers because they don't know what's coming with them. They don't know the type of tenant they're going to get. So we need some type of conversation to occur with developers to say, what incentives do you need in order to take these housing vouchers? But I think it shows we need an all hands on deck approach, and it needs to be a conversation with the development communities, with cities and counties, and frankly, with residents that need assistance. And that conversation isn't occurring in Tallahassee. In fact, to my knowledge, there's not one study going on right now in Tallahassee on housing. And that's just unacceptable when housing is one of the top issues of the state of Florida.
So you have a summit coming up on May 1st in the Tampa area where you're going to be discussing this. I think it's sponsored by and helped supported by the Builders Association there in Tampa. So it sort of shows their buy-in. What are you hoping the conference will achieve?
Yeah, so we're really talking about solutions. I think everybody talks about the problem. Nobody's really bringing solutions to bear. And so we're going to go through each one of our kind of segments of our best practices. We're going to do a deep dive, and then we're going to come up with a strategy for how we're going to go to Tallahassee and address this issue. Look, we've worked with Florida State and other organizations in order to come up with these best practices. We now have a defined list of best practices that we think the state should begin to implement. We're going to discuss those. We're going to hopefully bring city, county leaders in along with developers and begin to have a robust conversation about what do developers need in order to take vouchers? What are the concerns about accessory dwelling units in communities? What are the challenges of upzoning for communities? And frankly, what are the incentives that Tallahassee has to offer in order to get over some of those hurdles?
You've used the phrase best practices a few times, and I know that for people at home that can sort of seem like jargon or speak. When you gave me one example earlier of a best practice scrubbing through waiting lists, but what are some of the other things that could take place that aren't taking place currently?
Well, cities and counties need to allow for upzoning. For example, allowing for duplexes or triplexes to be built where a traditional single family home is being built. That is a best practice that we've seen around the country, as we have to allow for people to move beyond just single family homes and communities, and we need to allow for more density in those communities. And the only way we're going to do that is through a thing called upzoning, which we've identified as a best practice. Allowing for accessory dwelling units, it's a best practice that we've identified. It's by far the least expensive housing we can build today, and but yet most communities don't allow accessory dwelling units in certain areas of their communities. And we see this push me, pull me going on in Tallahassee. For example, Gainesville tried to do some upzoning, but the governor came in and squashed that. And so ultimately, we need to have a plan for how we're going to deal with 1,000 people a day moving to Florida. And that plan can't just be send people to the suburbs and grow the suburbs. No, it has to include what we're going to do in our local communities. And the simple truth is, if you don't fix zoning, you don't fix housing. And while we're fixing all of that, we need to have a robust voucher program in place to assist people today that are living in their cars, that are living in local motels because they don't have to come up with first and last month's rent, to stabilize them. In order to do that, we need a process that works, and we need developers that are willing to take them. There's really three parties involved: the local government, the individuals that are struggling, and developers in market rate products. The beautiful thing about vouchers is it allows people to choose where they live. They can live closer to their home. They can live closer to school. Florida has about 2.2 million people that would qualify potentially for vouchers if we had the funds available. Today, we have less than 100,000 people that are actively on housing vouchers. But it's shown really to be one of the most robust ways to get people housed quickly.
So roughly right now, the state of Florida spends about how much on vouchers, for housing vouchers?
So between state and federal dollars, we spend about $1.6 billion a year on vouchers. That only covers about 4.6% of eligible households. So we can imagine what that number would have to be. It would have to be closer to almost $25 to $30 billion in combined state and federal dollars. But I think it also shows the need that we're having. I mean, we're only funding 5%, less than 5% of the total need for housing affordability if we were to cover everybody in vouchers. Now, clearly, that's not possible to cover everybody with vouchers, and that's an astronomical amount of money. But it does show where we have room for growth and where we can make our voucher programs more efficient. And so I think it shows that there's a lot more we can do with the housing voucher program to make it more robust, and to find developers that are willing to participate, and to improve the products that we have out there existing in the marketplace today.
We'll be right back after the break.